Connecting to audio. Joe is.
That's one way to put it. Yeah.
Joe's connecting to audio. Hi, Joe. Hi, Joe. Are you there, Joe?
Joe, wave if you can hear us. Are you waving or what are you doing? You waving?
I talked to him this week, wondering where he's been.
Oh,
Well, he's working his way into this. One week he was getting on and he couldn't get the picture, and then he got the picture and that. But he's been around for several weeks.
But he wasn't on for 3 weeks. And so then I called him and said, what's going on? He said, well, sometimes he listens to it afterwards. Okay, which us too. And sometimes he was there and I didn't see him. But anyway, we had a nice chat.
that's so
Well,
nice.
he's here in his picture today. That's good.
Well, it's nice to touch base with him. That's so sweet.
Yeah, I know. I miss him. But
Oh, we miss him too.
All right.
Here's Elgin Mannard. We can't get rid of him. How'd the soccer game go, Elgin?
I need a foot.
They lost 5-0,
Oh no.
Hmm.
Ooh, that hurts.
but the technology
I'll-
was great.
You could see everything, every goal that you got against you, right? That's important.
Exactly. We could see the route.
Oh.
All right. Well, I am going to go ahead and mute everybody until you want to raise questions and whatnot. Yeah, it's 11:03. We'll go ahead and start. I've already got us going live on YouTube. It's good to see so many faces, and I'm excited to be able to work together and move through our class together on Rebels, Ranters, Rebels, Radicals, and Ranters, the unexpected history of Congregationalism. So let me say a quick prayer, and then we'll get started together. Lord, we thank you for this day. We thank you for the reminder that you call us to be a church that is that exists not for itself. It exists for the world around it. It exists to serve. And we pray, Lord, that spirit will more fully imbibe and be embodied in us, each day, and in our community as we strive to follow after you in this world. Be with us now, we pray, in your name. Amen. Amen. All right. Well, let me hit the share screen here. And as I've said before, from time to time, I may look a slightly distracted because I'll be letting folks in. But okay, so we are in session 9. I do want to kind of just remind everyone that I mentioned this last week, so I'll mention this again. Next week is our last session for the year 2020 in terms of this particular class. We will take off for Thanksgiving weekend. So the weekend of Thanksgiving, there will be no Sunday school, and then we're going to have 3 sessions in December, but they're not going to be in this particular topic. I'm going to revisit something that we weren't able to get to last summer about the formation of the Christian canon for one session. And then I have invited a good friend of mine and a former colleague to come and speak to us about African Christianity. He's a Nigerian theologian, and so he's going to take 2 weeks in December to talk a little bit about that. Then we will take a few days off or a few weekends off because of both the holidays and the congregational vote that'll be on January 10th. And then starting back on January 17th, I will give a 5 to 6 session sort of conclusion of our story, because we're obviously only going to make it up to about the Civil War or so for this one. So then we'll do a little bit on the second half to bring our story up to current times, which I think all of us will be interested in. I know I'm interested in doing some more discovery myself. All right, so we are, just to remind ourselves, right, we're doing this class because the challenge to be the church We have a tradition that we live in the midst of, that we are the product of, the congregational tradition. We're also in the middle of wrestling with and grappling with questions around our name, around what does it mean for us to be a congregational church, all these kinds of things. And so the history of congregationalism, revisiting that certainly seemed to be a very good decision. So we have moved our way through, starting back in the period of the English Reformation, up into the migration over to North America, and have gotten ourselves all the way up into the 18th century. So when we were in the 18th century, I had mentioned to you that there were two big things that churches had to wrestle with. One of them was the First Great Awakening, and the other was the Revolution, the American Revolution. And so last week before, we talked about the Awakening and responses to that, Jonathan Edwards being key in that. Last week we turned and began to talk about the Revolution and the Revolutionary era. We set the American Revolution in a much broader framework, which is where it belongs, in a larger revolutionary Atlantic framework. And we talked through some of that. And there were a couple of things that we noted that were important. The first, of course, is that congregational support for the revolution, very, very high, very strong. And there were a couple of changes that happened in terms of preaching themes. I mentioned that there was a concerted attempt to return, particularly to the stories, the narratives of the history of Israel in the Old Testament, for ways of thinking about how does God feel about a monarchy. And so the argument, of course, was against monarchy at this point in time, and so they were much more drawn to those kinds of passages. So the book of Exodus was important, the story in Samuel, and the selection of Saul, and the bad things that seemed to portend. Those were all insignificant. But probably the most important thing, particularly, especially as this is going to unfold, I think, as you'll see today, was a shift towards talking about that the gospel in large measure was interested especially in freedom, right? So the pursuit of liberty, obviously that fits quite well with the context at the time, right? Revolution, but it also fits very well with our own history and tradition, right? Local autonomy, all those kinds of things. So all of that stuff is sort of there, part of that in the background. The next thing we noted, of course, was the process of disestablishment. I'm not going to delve on this a ton as we move through, but I would say that disestablishment causes certain challenges for the church, probably the leading of which is what is the purpose of the church, right? If you are a state-sponsored entity, then you have sort of a de facto function, and once you move in a direction where you do not have that, so here I'm getting a chat already. Oh, yeah, so let me make sure I get everybody muted. I think everybody should be muted. If you're not muted, if you would mute yourself, that would be great. I think apparently someone's getting some background. It sounds like it might be Joe's iPad. All right, so I would have a hard time being able to mute you, I think, in this. Let me make sure. Yeah, it doesn't allow me to do that right here. Ooh, nope, okay. All right, so I'm gonna have to leave it up to you guys to figure out how to mute yourselves. Yeah, so disestablishment, right, which means no longer state church, right? No longer state-sponsored church. I talked about the fact that takes a little while. 1838 actually is when the last state-sponsored church is disestablished, which is the Congregational Church in the state of Massachusetts at the time. But what this means then is it means a new challenge, right? And in some ways, I think it becomes a very healthy thing for the Christian churches, because no longer are they wrapped up in state politics. No longer are pastors employees of the state. They're now simply people who are called to preach the gospel, seek the gospel, equip folks to do those kinds of things. So disestablishment will become a significant component, but we'll only hit on that every now and again. I also had a section I called other developments. We talked about music, right? The fact that for much of the early history of the congregational churches in North America, they are not using hymns. They're not even using musical notation. Most of the time they're singing probably words that come out of the Psalms, and people are pretty much from memory doing their best, and the music wasn't great. That's what we wind up getting from a lot of the diaries, journals, and letters of the pastors. And so when we get into the 18th century, this begins to shift. We start to see congregations utilizing musical instruments, musical notation, and adopting and adapting hymnals and hymns for singing in church. We also have a leveling of the social structure in terms of the way that churches are seating people. I mentioned to you that prior to this period, the late 18th century, when you came in, you knew the most important people in town sat at the very front, and there was a sort of a hierarchical social order that was displayed in where people sat in the church. This begins finally to kind of dissolve a little bit. It takes a while, but it starts at least in the late 18th century, more than likely because of some of the basic impulses in the air around the revolution and freedom and equality and those kinds of things. And then I mentioned the fact that there's a growing theological factions in the church. That is, in the congregational setting at least, there's a liberal tradition, a more rationalizing tradition that is particularly located geographically in Massachusetts, particularly on the East Coast. And then a tradition that maybe finds more of its gravitational center at Yale in the Connecticut area. And that's the one, of course, that's especially influenced by Jonathan Edwards. They come to be called the New Divinity. And so just giving us a sense that we have enough time now, we have a tradition that's mature enough where you start to now see different iterations of that tradition, right? And well thought through iterations of what that's going to look like. And then lastly, I turn and start to talk a little bit about early abolitionism, because that's going to become so central, not just to the story of North America as we move into the 19th century, but also the story of Congregationalism during that period, because there are so many Congregationalists who play a role in one way or another. That's not to say that all of Congregationalism is that way, which I hope you'll see today. But certainly there are some very important figures, and I'll touch on those. So growing but marginal agitation, and then I talked to you about the kind of significant historical moment, at least in the history of certainly Afro-Protestantism, and that is the ordination of Lemuel Haynes, who is the first African-American ordained by a major Protestant body in North America. And that Protestant body is a congregational church. So Congregationalists have that as part of their history, their DNA. Okay, so that's kind of last week. So that's sort of the backdrop. And one of the things that I mentioned is, and one of the reasons I think that we got the setup for the revolution component and the Great Awakening element was just to give us a sense that the bigger questions that are swirling around in society are also going to be important in the churches. And that's certainly the case in terms of what we talked about in the 18th century, and it remains the case in the 19th century. But the question sort of slightly alters, right? So if the question before is, should we have a revolution? Should we strive to get rid of monarchy and set up something else? And even if you're successful, right, in the revolution, in the sense is successful in that regard, what exactly is this newfound freedom going to look like, right? That becomes then the driving question in the early republic. And so that's what I say when I'm describing here the dialectics of the democratic experiment. And these questions, the ones that I have listed here, really become the fodder for debate. And the dialectic element is the notion that we're struggling for freedom, and yet we still need some kind of order. right? That's the dialectic. How do we enact real freedom and yet maintain some level of order? And should institutions play a role in this, right? This dialectic. And of course, as I mentioned there at the very last comment, because the founders fail, frankly, to deal with the question of slavery. Can that really be reconciled with a culture that argues that it's especially concerned to pursue liberty, right, or freedom? So these are the questions then that are kind of floating around in the air, and they're going to wind up seeping into churches, but they're going to be translated. Not just that you're arguing about bigger political things, they're going to be translated into theological kinds of language. And so that's what I want to talk about here to sort of set the stage before we get more squarely into what are Congregationalists doing. So this is the big question. These are the big questions. How is that then translated into the life of the churches? And now I'm going to walk you through three big areas where we see this. And I do want to say, as a preface, in these three areas, these are not just questions that Congregationalists are wrestling with. All right. And as it turns out, when we get into the 19th century, some of the denominational walls begin to fade away a little bit. Part of that is because of the Great Awakening that has already happened, and also because there's going to be a second Great Awakening that's going on early on. And there's going to be a general sense among Protestants, particularly, that they have more in common than not. And so their lines of demarcation are going to still be there, but they're going to be much more permeable. And so the ideas that I'm going to talk to you about, some of them are going to be cobbled together from Methodist ideas and Baptist ideas and Congregationalist ideas, as you're going to see when we move through. So these are things that are going on, but they wind up becoming important in a number of different circles, and certainly Congregationalists play a role in this. So the first one that I would say, the first sort of, and this is, by the way, this is the time here at the beginning, I just want you to know I'm going to be a little theological, all right? So if that's just, put on your helmet or whatever, or turn off my voice and come back to it later, whatever it is you want to do, it's fine. So Christian perfection, all right? So Christian perfection literally is a kind of doctrine. It's a belief that the task of what it means to be a Christian is to pursue some form of moral perfection, all right? And I'm going to talk a little bit about what does that look like. It doesn't, and I will say, it doesn't just mean on a personal level. It also tends to mean personally and socially. Those two things go together very strongly in this tradition, all right? And so this then is the first sort of expression of the freedom question, right? So in a sense, like, you're set free from sin to pursue perfection, right? So that whole freedom question, the one that we talked about before, this is how it's being translated into churches. So it's rooted in the theology of Wesley, but its development comes through the help of other figures. The most important Congregationalist in this regard is Nathaniel William Taylor, and he is a professor down at Yale. He's working in the early part of the 19th century up into about the 1830s or so. And he argues what he calls is, he creates a system that's called God's moral government. And his argument is that the way that God interacts with humankind is to encourage them to, as free moral agents, to accept God's grace so that they can choose not to sin. All right, that's very important. So as you see here on your screen, an ingredient idea for Taylor is that human beings are not born sinful by nature, i.e. original sin, but rather they are sinners by choice. So we're not going to talk about sin in a sort of abstract sense. We're only going to talk about sin as actual choices that we make. And of course, Taylor would say everyone is a sinner, because if you just look at everyone's life, you're going to see them making bad choices. But it's not because of some abstract thing. So if they're making bad choices, part of the way that God interacts with them is to enable them not to have to make those bad choices. right? So God's moral government then becomes a way of talking about how you can get free from those bad choices and conversely make good choices, all right? We also hear then the development of a category that's going to become especially important in the broader society called the higher law. And here, this is going to become important as we move into debates around slavery, because debates around slavery are going to start out by, well, it's legal, it's the law. And someone like Taylor or others is going to argue, well, the law on earth does not always mirror God's law, right? And God's law is the one that says that it is not right for some people to be enslaved and in chains while other people go about living their lives freely, etc. So as I say here, for Taylor and others, by the power of the Spirit, people can begin to choose to live according to the moral law. And the task and the calling of a Christian is precisely to discern how to do that, and then also potentially to struggle to install that law into larger human structures. So one of the arguments that someone like Taylor or others is going to say is that part of the problem with our social order in regards to slavery is precisely that we have laws that are fundamentally demonic, right? And they need to be changed. And the higher law is what they're going to appeal to as the source from which we draw that. So God's moral government, right, shaping the way that people interact with one another and with God around the pursuit of moral perfection. Now, can you realize that perfection in life or not? That's another big question. And so this then leads to the second point here. And so for some people, like Taylor, they're going to say, it's your task to pursue perfection, but whether or not you'll truly be perfect in life, probably not. Others, however, particularly in Methodist circles, but sometimes those Methodist ideas are going to seep into other places like among Congregationalists. Others are going to argue that in fact you can live into a kind of total perfection, right? Or something like they would call entire sanctification. So sanctification is a word that we often use in Christian theological jargon. Justification refers to my relationship with God, right? I've become justified, I come to faith, I'm embraced by God, saved through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, etc., right? Well, then what happens after that? Well, after that, the rest of my life is supposed to be about cultivating a life of holiness or a life of sanctification. So can someone be truly, fully sanctified in this life? And this is a question that people are wrestling with. And again, you can hear here in the backdrop, can we really live in a truly free and responsible fashion, right? That would be sort of the way it would connect to that broader social correlate. So some are going to argue maybe you can realize perfection in this life, and others are going to be less certain about that. And I think Taylor would be one who's less certain about that, while others would be much more, say, someone like a John Fletcher, who was an associate of Wesley, but lived a little bit beyond Wesley's life. Finally, lastly, how does all this stuff intersect with the broader social order? It does so, at least during this time. The argument is that what we're trying to do is to prepare our society for the beginning of the millennium. Right? And so millennium is not, we're not referring here to the year 2000, of course. We're referring here to the millennia of the 1,000-year reign of Christ that's spoken of in the book of Revelation. And a post-millennial person, as opposed to a premillennial person, believes that the millennium starts now sometime, and that Christ comes at the end or post the end of that period. Whereas a premillennial, which is something that you probably have heard of before now, is that Jesus comes back and starts the millennium, right? That's typically the left behind stuff. So most people, though, back in this period are not premillennial. In fact, premillennialism doesn't really exist in the way that you and I might be used to hearing about it. It's something that actually comes into being in the late 19th century. Most people back then are more post-millennial, and that means they're much more optimistic that we can actually create a righteous society, right? And that's what they want to do. So personal sanctification, personal holiness carries with it the correlate of social sanctification or social holiness, right? That's kind of the idea. So these things then are going to push you into very significant struggles. And obviously, the most important struggle during this period is the struggle around slavery. And so this is the second big area where we see the churches wrestling and struggling. So abolitionism is very, very important. And I mean here by abolitionism, abolition of slavery. Now, there are at least 3 different positions that we can find around the question of slavery. I mentioned last week that in regards to these questions, you have opposition to the slave trade, opposition to the institution of slavery, and then the question around racism or discrimination, right? And these are 3 different things that are not always aligned with one another in a specific individual and how they think about these issues. When I talk about abolition here, I'm talking specifically about the eradication of the first 2. Most people are talking about the eradication both of the trade and the institution. It leaves open the question of discrimination, and so you can have people who are actually very strong abolitionists, but they're still racist, right? And so, and that just so that you know that these things are not necessarily coupled. In terms of abolition, there are also basically 2 broad positions. One is immediate abolition. That is, we need to get, these things are sin. We need to get rid of them now, right? If I can be set free now, if I'm called to live a righteous life now, then we need to get rid of these things now. Or you can have gradual abolition, which is more like we recognize these things are bad, but they're bound up in our social order, in our economic order, and we need to slowly but surely dismantle them, right? And you have this struggle actually among abolitionists over which of these 2 is the more appropriate approach. Well, in the circles that we're talking about, particularly those who have become influenced by Christian perfectionism, they are almost always going to be immediate abolitionist folks, and I'll talk about that in just a second. Obviously, the first thing here that I want to highlight for you is the assumption that everyone has that slavery is sin. It's a systemic sin, which means it's part of the social system, but it's still an expression of sin. And a figure that I'll mention hopefully later on if we get to him, Theodore Weld, who grows up in the house of a Congregationalist minister and has a very long history in the Congregationalist circles. I've provided for you a quote here from him where he says, "Every man knows that slavery is a sin, and whoever denies this, his lips libel his heart." So a very strong sense in most of these circles, particularly having lived through the revolution now, that slavery is a sin and that it must be dealt with. It must be grappled with in the same way that you would grapple with any other sin that you might find in your own life. Well, you must immediately get rid of it, right? Immediate abolition. Christian perfection is going to push you in that direction. We can't just wait around. The more we wait around, the more it's going to corrupt us, is sort of the argument. In addition to this, though, what we find, and I'm going to talk about this in just a moment, is not just a concern around slavery, but once you have a concern about one social sin, it's going to pique your interest about other social sins, right? And so, as I say here, universal reform also becomes a big part of the story during this time. And I'm going to talk a little bit later on, not today, more than likely next week, about the proliferation of what are called voluntary societies. And so this is a period in American history where you just see all of a sudden tons and tons of voluntary societies popping up all over the place to deal with certain things or to create, some of them of course are to create fellowship or other kinds of opportunities or democratic, to facilitate democratic participation or things of that nature. But you also see voluntary societies propping up specifically to wrestle with other challenges like women's rights. And women's rights here, number one, of course, refers to the right to vote, but it can also be broader, the right to preach, the right to have access to maybe a careers outside of the home. But certainly this is the first wave of feminism, what it comes to be called, and it's rooted in radical evangelical and congregationalist circles. Issues around temperance, right? So temperance here refers to alcohol, and temperance tends to be has to do with hard liquor, and the motivating factor tends to be domestic abuse, right? So there's so much domestic abuse going on that we need to help these people by limiting their access to liquor. They can certainly still drink beer or wine or something like that, but it was hard liquor. You also have labor rights, et cetera. But so what I'm trying to say though is that at the base of this is a struggle around slavery, which then connects you to other issues. And so this period, the 1820s, 30s, 40s, up into the 50s or so, early 50s, is strongly aimed at tackling these issues. The last one, then I'm going to take some questions. I know there's been a couple of comments, I think, in the chat. The last one has to do with the question of institutions, right? Remember I said before that that's going to be part of the dialectic that shapes the American experience, which is how do we have freedom with order, and what is the role of institutions in helping that happen, right? Because there's a kind of suspicion, right, of certain institutions. And I think it'd be fair to say that in the congregational tradition that we have seen, there is a suspicion about having too much power in larger institutions that are over or above local congregations. So the problem of denominationalism is a sort of expression of this. Can denominational structures, do they facilitate or do they hamper the preaching of the gospel, the doing of mission work, the pursuit of Christian perfection, and very importantly for some of these figures, the attempt to get rid of slavery, right? And people are going to be frustrated to a certain extent around these issues and around the slowness of denominationalisms. And as I say here, it really becomes exacerbated in the North, and in particular over the abolitionist movement and ideas around Christian perfection. And the reason for that is that almost all denominational officials are located on the East Coast, right? They're located in sort of traditional centers of power, and they are often deeply suspicious of Christian ideas of Christian perfection, because those sound like ideas that are kind of happening out on the frontier, and they also are they're much more the challenge of abolition for a lot of folks on the East Coast, even in New England, is just as difficult as it would be if you went further south. And the reason that their economies are bound up in the slave trade or in utilizing goods and products produced by slave labor, et cetera. So they're more suspicious of these things that I've been talking about here. And because of that, and I'm going to tell some stories about this, because of that, especially in places like New York, upstate New York, and the Ohio Valley, which is now opened up and is beginning, lots and lots of Congregationalists are moving into these areas as part of the settlers. They're going to begin to decide that they need to leave these congregational structures, and this produces a phenomenon that, at least in the literature, is called come-outerism, which is a little weird, but it just means to come out. Right, we're going to leave denominational structures behind, and then we're going to create connections with other like-minded single congregations that are going to have, that's going to enable us to mutually support one another, but it's not going to have the oversight authority that a larger denominational structure would have. So this is this come-outerism and unionism. And the congregational model, the polity model that we are used to as a congregational church, is going to be very, very attractive, not just to congregational churches, but also to Presbyterian churches, to Methodist churches, and of course, certainly to Baptist churches, because they already have a congregational model. But my point is that there are going to be other Protestant groups who are not traditionally Congregationalist in their polity, but who are so irritated with the denomination and the officials and the constant compromising on slavery, that they are going to leave the denominations and effectively become Congregationalists to a certain extent, right? And so the model that we have embodied becomes attractive for navigating this problem. All right, so let me stop there. I've given you a lot to work with here at the beginning. I think I saw several questions in the chat. I'll open these up here. All right, so we'll start with Elgin. When we choose not to sin, what kinds of sin does he have in mind, behavior or belief? That's a great question, Elgin. I think it tends to be behavioral. So it tends to be a focus on moral behavior. That's the primary issue. Let's see. Then Tom offers to us a commentary. All right, if you think you have reached perfection, then you probably have not reached it. Postmillennialism lost momentum after World War I. Actually, postmillennialism, as you'll see, is going to lose momentum after the Civil War. But we'll talk about that. But yes, it's true. It's of a time. It doesn't go away though. It's still around. And then John Seberg has a question here. How about scripture like slaves obey your masters, etc.? Didn't preachers and others use these? Yes, absolutely. So this is a great question, John. There's a fabulous little book called, I think it's called something like The Theological Meaning of the Civil War. It's a very short little book by Mark Knoll. And in that book, he tracks the debates that are going on between anti-slavery theologians and pastors in the North and pro-slavery theologians and pastors in the South. And they are actually debating these things in journals, in theological journals. And what he notes in there, what you kind of see as you read through, is that if it's just about quoting verbatim literal texts, that the Southern folks have an argument to make. What happens in the North, though, and I think this is important, is a more sophisticated hermeneutic begins to develop. And it doesn't come initially out of white Protestant circles. It actually comes out of Afro-Protestant circles in the form of the slave narrative. So if you ever watch or read, or I shouldn't say watch, but if you ever read any of the slave narratives, and there's something like 18,000 of them, but like let's say just the most popular would be like a Frederick Douglass. They almost always, Jesus shows up somehow, and the slave is configured not as the outsider, but rather as where Jesus is. So Jesus is with the slave. Frederick Douglass has this scene where he talks about this woman who basically is whipped almost to death, and this is at the beginning of his life, and she's sort of hung up like on a cross. And he talks about that was the experience of entering into the hell of slavery. So it's literally like the death of Jesus. And then you go through the narrative and you come to the key scene when Frederick Douglass is about to win his freedom, and he's in the middle of a fight with the worst of all the slave drivers and owners that he's had to experience, a man named Covey. And he talks about how he rose. He says, like, so like there's this scene of resurrection. And that's just one example. Others are even more explicit. But my point is that once you start to tell the story of Jesus and you start to realize that from the perspective of Jesus, where is Jesus going to be? He's not going to be with the powerful. He's going to be with the powerless. And that's the hermeneutic that really begins to develop and at least enables Northern folk to hold, to kind of hold at bay. I mean, ultimately, the arguments, they don't wind up persuading, right? What winds up persuading is muskets, and a general strike by the slaves themselves when they get up and walk off their plantation. So, yeah. Let's see, Tom Cooner, second comment from Tom, reminds me of the discussion of Noah being a righteous man, or was he just the most righteous man? That might be from something I mentioned earlier. I can't really quite place that, but Sherry Hall, can you explain more about people being anti-slavery but still racist? Yeah, so I think I've mentioned before, like racism, theories of racial hierarchy, they are invented in some sense to justify slavery. So first you have enslavement, which of course is specifically about power and economics. Well, then you have a lot of people who are like, why is this happening? Well, then they're going to come up with the theories to justify it. Excuse me. But over time, these two things can come uncoupled, right? Because the basic argument is, why are these people enslaved? Well, they're enslaved because they deserve to be enslaved, right? The racial assumptions. Well, people can come to realize that enslavement is wrong, but that doesn't necessarily change their assumption or their assessment that the people who were enslaved might have deserved it somehow. So that tends to be, I think, the way that these two things become uncoupled. Excuse me, I've got a little something tickling in the back of my throat here. All right. Does anybody else want to make a comment, or just so I can not talk for a second? So Cheryl asks, when did they walk off the plantations? That happens pretty much early on during the Civil War period, 1860s, 1861. Close to half are the numbers estimated. Slaves hear about the war, and they literally desert plantations. They attempt to move north. This is one of the reasons why you wind up getting regiments that you hear about, or we watch movies regarding around African Americans who make up those. Those are not made up exclusively of northern free slaves. The slave owners would have chased after them if they could, but once they move into the north and the war is going on, I don't think that would be plausible. And I'm not sure that the reason that the South decides to invade the North has to do specifically with recapturing slaves who had escaped. I think it was there was something else going on there. Good question, though. Other comments, questions? Okay. Well, I think that cough
Christian?
thing, whatever it was, it's left.
Christian,
Comment in the background there?
do you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. So do you believe that most of the North, when they go to the Civil War, are they thinking that they're going to fight to prohibit slavery, or they have some other thing in mind?
That's a good question. I think I can put it in reverse, and I can say that from the perspective of the South, the move to secede is clearly and explicitly and repeatedly about slavery, about protecting the institution of slavery. I mean, this shows up in speeches, public proclamations, sermons, initial addresses when Jefferson Davis first gets sworn as president of the Confederate States, etc. They make it explicitly clear that is precisely why they have chosen to secede. I don't know if I can answer in the North, and I know the typical argument in sort of grade school was always that it was a fight to preserve the Union. But certainly from the perspective of abolitionists, that is not the case. So that's about as far as I can go right now in terms of my knowledge of answering that question. But it's a good question.
Christian, I have a question about William Wilberforce.
Yes.
I was wondering what influence the abolitionist movement that was occurring at this time in England had on what was happening in the U.S. It seems to me like there's a parallel path there.
I can say very. I don't have tons of sort of examples of this, but I can say that we had talked last week about the construction of a kind of revolutionary Atlantic network, right? So the ideas around the American Revolution connect with ideas in the French Revolution, connect with the Irish Uprising, connect with the Haitian Revolution, connect with, and some of this stuff is a mixture of anti-slavery and other kinds of motivations. Well, I think that same network then, right, this connection between 4 continents, right, Africa, South America, Europe, North America, becomes a sort of matrix in which literature and actions are going to be spread pretty rapidly. So the work that's going on, for instance, in North America, or not North America, but in England, around Wilberforce, with John Wesley writing tracts against slavery. And of course, he's whispering into the ear of Wilberforce, metaphorically speaking. Odalawa Equiano, who was a former slave, who writes a very, very important text, kind of anti-slavery sort of slave narrative that influences Wilberforce. All of that stuff is definitely going to make its way into North America. So it's going to come in the form of writings, and it's going to come in the form of legislative strategies. So I would say there's definitely an impact. Now, me being able to provide specific ways that say Wilberforce connects here in North America, I just don't know enough. But I can say, yes, there is definitely a connection, particularly, I think it'd be fair to say, particularly when abolition is to a certain extent still something of a minority position. You're going to be looking for allies wherever you can find them. And if you find really strong allies, even if it's in the UK, which you've just fought a war to break away from, you're still going to be interested in making connections with those allies. Great question. Thank you for that. Other comments, questions? All right. Let me move us forward.
Christian?
Yeah.
So what period are you trying to focus in on here? What years are we looking at now?
We're mostly looking here at the early 19th century, so the first 40 or so years. So 1800 up into, and I think particularly as we get up into the 1830s and 40s.
So what do you think about the effect of the book Uncle Tom's Cabin?
That clearly has a big effect in the North. It's obviously banned in the South. There's a famous little story of Harriet Beecher meeting Lincoln in the 1860s, and he says, "Oh, you're that little woman that wrote a book that started the Civil War." Yeah, and I'll mention that book here in just a couple of minutes. But we're starting at least our story. I'm kind of say so. Someone like Nathaniel William Taylor, who I've mentioned a few times, most of his time he's thriving in the early 19th century. So we're seeding ideas in a sense that then are going to take off because really like significant abolition agitation starts really in the 1830s and 40s. Like it starts to grow as a movement. So let me actually turn to a couple of historical things just to kind of give us some more anchor points. I appreciate that question. There are 2 significant additional background pieces that I think are important for understanding some of the developments that will happen in congregational circles. The first is the Second Great Awakening, and the second is what I'm going to call in just a minute, or what was called the Plan of Union. And I'll talk a little bit about both of those here really quickly. So what is the Second Great Awakening? First of all, it is much like the first, a kind of second wave of significant interest in religion. This time, though, it's a longer period and it's more diffuse, right? We had mentioned already that the First Great Awakening starts out as regional and then eventually becomes a single thing. I think it'd be fair to say that this one never becomes a single thing, but it's sort of a series or a wave of interest. And there basically are three phases that scholars will highlight. So the first phase is located in the frontier. The frontier here is particularly, we're talking about the Ohio River Valley, upstate New York, Cumberland region in sort of western Virginia down into Kentucky, portions of what eventually come to be called Tennessee. Those are the frontier areas that we're referring to. A second phase, right? So it starts in the frontier, starts in the hinterland, and then makes its way east. And there's a second prominent phase that happens especially in New England. And this features some very significant and prominent Congregationalists like Lyman Beecher, right? Obviously connected to Harriet Beecher Stowe. I believe he was her father or grandfather, I can't remember. And then the last phase is connected to Charles Grandison Finney, who starts out as a Presbyterian but ends his career as a Congregationalist. And Finney does most of his work in New York, Western New York, Rochester, some stuff in New York City, and then eventually in Oberlin, so Ohio. So you have a general sensibility that the Second Great Awakening is probably to be understood as predominantly a northern phenomenon, right? So mostly New York State, New England, Ohio River Valley, but there is some frontier stuff that would go down into what the areas that we might traditionally call the South. So what are some things we can say about this? So what are some characteristics? There's a couple of things we can say. Number one, there is some continuity with the First Great Awakening in the sense that we are talking here about a revival of interest, people becoming more concerned around religious questions, attending church more, attending tent revivals. This is the period of the tent revival, and I'll talk a little bit about that more. So some continuity, but it's the sort of discontinuities that I think make this also really interesting. So the first one is that Arminianism becomes a much more dominant theological influence. So if the First Great Awakening was still pretty much Calvinist, by this point in time, Calvinism begins to be displaced. And the issue here is around human freedom. Are human beings able to respond to the gospel that's being preached and offered to them or not? And of course, the Arminians are going to argue, yes, human beings are free and responsible. And that's obviously also going to translate into something like a doctrine of Christian perfection, which we talked about earlier. The use of what come to be called the new measures. So the new measures are, we're not just going to have revival in churches. You guys there?
Yeah.
How long did I go out?
10 seconds.
Okay, good. All right, I stopped once everybody's face froze. Sorry about that. The internet here is not always great. So we're going to now go and set up tents on the frontier, and we're going to invite people in, and we're going to have 24-hour meetings. Right, that's what the protracted meeting is. We're going to have preaching that's more emotional, or maybe we're going to create legal arguments. Finney was very famously known for like doing legal arguments for how and I don't exactly how those kind of work out. I'd have to go and look up a couple of examples, but one of my favorite examples, of course, is the anxious bench, right? So this is a bench that's placed at the front and it's left empty, right? And maybe grandma drags you by the ear, brings you down and plops you down there, and you have to sit there and listen to the preacher until you finally embrace Jesus. And Finney actually is going to use the anxious bench differently, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. But so the willingness then to adopt and adapt new things in order, and from the perspective of some people, it's manipulative. The people who oppose the Second Great Awakening see this as a manipulative practice. But nevertheless, this is part of that religious culture. We also see during this period the Methodists and the Baptists become the largest Protestant traditions in North America. They wind up eclipsing the Presbyterians and the Congregationalists. And the 19th century is dominated especially by Methodism. You also have during this period new denominations that are going to show up. So there's a lot of what eventually come to be called American-born churches, including the Mormon tradition or the Seventh-day Adventists. And I know some people may or may not see those as being Christian or whatnot, but that's part of this period of a proliferation of new expressions. And then lastly, definitely different is the connection between revival and social reform. This becomes this is exceptionally present, right? That is, if you're going to embrace Jesus, you need to now enter into the path of discipleship, and that means to become concerned with issues like abolition of slavery, women's right to vote, temperance, literacy, etc. So I've given to you several iterations here of things that you can see, just so you can see the range of issues. Now, the most important one is the abolition issue, but these are all there. These are all a part of that. And actually, the way that Finney, I mentioned before, the way that Finney used the anxious bench is that he believed that when someone came forward, he did an altar call, someone would come forward, respond to the gospel. The first act of discipleship should be that they sign up immediately for the abolitionist movement, right? They become part of that. And if they didn't, he put them in the anxious bench, and they had to sit there and listen to him preach on why, concern around these issues was part of what it meant to be Christian. So again, a very strong sort of engagement with social issues. And this is why we can see that larger question around democracy, freedom, institutions, and order, et cetera. How is that going to be worked out? So in the East, in sort of the congregational centers in the East, I mentioned there's a New England phase. This is obviously a very important phase because, for our story at least, because this is where congregationalism, sort of where its hubs are. And so, for instance, Yale College experiences
You're cutting out.
be a little bit more conservative in terms of the expressions of revivalism. They would like something with more decorum, and they tend to be more conservative in regards to connecting revival to social order, to social reform. So a couple of the key figures here: Lyman Beecher, Timothy Dwight. Those are the most important Congregationalists during the New England phase on the East Coast. Let me stop there for just a second and see. I've got a couple of chat comments here. So we seem to be wrestling with the same issues today of distrust of us. Yes, that's yeah. It's it's sort of it seems like it's a cyclical part of our history, right? And it's always a question of how do we square the pursuit of freedom, and what should that freedom really look like, with the need for order and the human need of institutions to organize our lives. I think Vivian said here that I froze up briefly there around the Yale College.
You did.
Okay. But you can see, I hope, down here that Yale College experiences 15 different periods of revival from between 1800 and 1840. And that's just to give you a sense of places where these things are happening. All right, are there any other comments or questions before I shift to the last thing I want to highlight? All right. Okay, so the last thing that we want to highlight before we kind of turn and talk about the actual some of the examples is what's called the Plan of Union. And basically, we can describe this as an attempt by Congregationalists and Presbyterians missionizing the frontier. That's pretty much what the Plan of Union is. So the background is just recognizing that there is a significant decline among congregational churches that's happening. Again, as I mentioned, Methodists and Baptists are going to wind up eclipsing Congregationalists and Presbyterians across the country. We talked about splits and divisions. I haven't talked about the Unitarian schism, but that's going to come up in about a week or two. So that's going to add to your problems in terms of growth and cooperating and doing mission work. And then there are already significant connections between Presbyterians and Congregationalists. They share a similar history. They were all a part of the Puritan thing going on back in England that we talked about during this period. And there are state congregational associations that exist during this period, but there's no national congregational association. There's just state level congregational associations, and those are going to become sort of the denominational centers. So what do they decide to do? They say, hey, we have these shared histories, we have a shared theology for the most part in terms of Calvinism or some form of modified Calvinism. Let's create a plan of union, right? And that's what happens. That happens in 1801, where if you guys have a couple of Presbyterian pastors, they'd be willing to pastor a congregational church, in this area. And maybe we have some congregational pastors and you have a Presbyterian church that needs a pastor, and we're willing to allow our congregational pastor to do that for you. So that's sort of the idea of sharing pastors. Each church is going to be allowed to choose its own polity. Is it going to be a Presbyterian church or a congregational church? And specifically, this is especially going on in the Ohio Valley and upstate New York, Western New York, et cetera. Now, this does wind up disproportionately negatively affecting Congregationalists. And I think the reason perhaps for this is that the Presbyterian denominational structures provide more control and maybe more stability to a certain extent. For instance, if a congregational church wanted to leave and become Presbyterian, it only required about a 2/3 vote in affirmation. But if a Presbyterian church wanted to leave the presbytery to become congregational, it required a unanimous vote, right? So there just are certain things that got built in, and many churches that started Congregationalist during this time actually end up Presbyterian. So the Plan of Union winds up actually being a bit of a disaster for Congregationalists. But this loosening of distinctions is going to have a different set of repercussions, one of which is going to be that the congregational polity becomes popular for a lot of churches that actually want to leave their denominations, particularly over issues of slavery. The Plan of Union is finally ended in the 1850s, and Congregationalists at that point in time, they look back and view it as a complete disaster. Even if that's not, I don't know if that's totally fair or not, but let me stop there for just a second. Looks like I've got a chat here. So Haley has a comment here. Appears to be a reckoning within the church every 500 years. What are you seeing emerge within the church in regards to another 500-year reformation being due in this day and age, possibly as history repeats itself? Yeah, maybe, as you say, a reckoning in the call of the church for social justice, to engage in social justice reform. Yeah, I don't know how to answer that, Haley. At least in terms of a 500-year reformation, I do think, yeah, that history does sometimes rhyme. I don't know that it always repeats itself. I like that. So I think that's been used a few times. You know, does history repeat itself or does it rhyme? And I think it rhymes more than it necessarily repeats itself. But I think obviously a big challenge that we're going to have is staying together. I think if one of the premises of my comments today has been that churches are not immune from larger social conversations that are going on, right? And the larger social conversation at that time was, how are we going to enact this democracy that we seem to have just found? And what are we going to do with some of the contradictions in our society, like slavery, et cetera? And that immediately translates itself into church life. Obviously, we have challenges right now, right?
Yeah.
Around different perspectives, right? Different positions around issues of, we can't even agree on the same facts on some things, right? So I think those are going to be the kinds of challenges that are going to face the churches. How do we stay together through this need to commit to truth, need to commit to justice and equity, et cetera. So these are, I think this is going to be the same kinds of things that are going to hit us. And exactly what that's going to look like, I don't know. I'm not sure. I'm not a prophet. I'm just a poor pastor and professor. So that's the best answer I can give to you. Other comments? Let's see, what time is it here? Let me run us through just a few, because we've spent all this time building up, and I've got 2 pages of examples, but I'm just going to run through 1 page. We'll come back to the others next week, just to give you a sense of what happens, particularly in sort of the more progressive or radical circles. The opening comment here is just to continue to remember, within the context of the plan of union, where denominational walls are kind of coming down a little bit, and the fervor of Second Great Awakening, when you also have a kind of permeable element, right? That Protestants are kind of working with one another. Congregational polity becomes very attractive for a lot of folks outside of Congregationalism, right? They become very interested in this because it's like local democracy, right? This is how we're going to realize freedom. And of course, if they're really upset, like in Methodist circles, they're really upset that the Methodist denomination keeps compromising on slavery. And eventually some of them are going to leave and set up other Methodist churches, like the Free Methodists or the Reformed Methodists, et cetera. So what are some examples of things that we can see here, particularly pertinent to us and to our story? Well, upstate and Western New York is really a hotbed of Congregationalist and revivalist activity, right? So particularly 1830s, 1840s, upstate New York, Rochester, those areas, all that's very important. It because of all of the revival work that's going over, it actually comes to be called the burned over district, right? It's seen revival fires happen so many times that they call it the burned over district. There are numerous churches that are going to wind up linking Congregationalism and abolitionism as 2 different ways to resist tyranny, right? So we're going to resist the tyranny of denominational structures, of people trying to tell us what to do who don't live here and aren't part of our local congregation. And we're going to see abolition or enslavement, of course, also as a form of tyranny, right? And this also includes more than just, in some cases, as you'll see in just a second, it's more than just the issue of abolishing slavery. There's actually also an anti-racist element that some of these churches have. So equal rights for African Americans, that's more than just the abolishing of slavery. Equal rights for women, that's more than just the abolishing of slavery. So I'll give you a couple examples of that in just a second here. The second example that I wanted to tell you about that I thought was really interesting that I found in some of my research was the founding of the Liberty Party. So the Liberty Party, if you know anything about American history, you know that there are these little political parties every now and then that'll pop up and the Liberty Party pops up. It lives, exists for about 10 years or so. It's one of the precursors to the Republican Party eventually, and the Free State or the Free Soil Party that eventually creates the Republican Party in the 1850s. So it has that kind of lineage. Well, this is a party that is explicitly religious, it's explicitly abolitionist, and it's explicitly supportive of equal rights for African Americans and women. And it's a party that winds up having Congregationalists being intimately involved both in writing the party platform, and in fact, the first convention of the party is actually held in a Congregationalist church. So Congregationalists kind of give birth to this political party that has this kind of deep commitment to social engagement. And two other little examples. So these are personal people examples, and one is, we've already talked, of course, about Lemuel Hayes. So Samuel Ringo Ward is another African American Congregationalist pastor, right? So his date's 1817 to 1866. He is an African American pastor at the South Butler Congregational Church in South Butler, New York. And this guy, I don't know if you know that much about the history of abolitionism, but this guy is extraordinarily, he's like a giant. In fact, Frederick Douglass thought that he was the best thinker and speaker among all of the abolitionists that were working during this period. So he winds up organizing abolitionist interests in the United States. He travels up into Canada, in Ontario. He also makes his way over to the United Kingdom, and so has interactions there where he speaks to the London Anti-Slavery Society. So he is part of that larger international network of anti-slavery engagement. And then in the 1850s, he begins to think about like what are we going to do when slavery is over? Because he knows, that there's discrimination that people face, African Americans face. So he starts to work with Frederick Douglass to create a labor union. This is primarily to assist freedmen, so freed African Americans who are already free before the Civil War. But they create the first labor union for African Americans, the American League of Colored Workers, for colored laborers. And then our last example, also connected to this church, which is kind of interesting, South Butler, is the ordination of the first woman by a major Protestant denomination, Antoinette Brown. She serves then, as I say here, as the first clergywoman in the United States. And she is installed as pastor in 1852 with the same South Butler, New York Congregational Church. She is a student at Oberlin College. I'll talk about Oberlin next week because that's another important institutional expression of this kind of congregational radicalism. And again, it's not just Congregationalists, there are others there who are also encouraging some of this. So, but this gives you a sense of a series of figures and a series of events that have deep connections to Congregationalism, in which we see people who are trying to live out this sense of freedom attained, the necessity of thinking about what is that going to look like as we move into the future. What kinds of institutions are we going to need, right? I mean, you have the founding of a college, Oberlin, so it's clearly can't be all anti-institutional. But how are we going to navigate also, frozen again. Am I back now?
Yes.
Okay, I only froze up for a second there, that's good. Whew. And I pay for the good stuff and I still get frozen. Anyway, you have this, again, you have folks who then, they embody that desire, right, to attain that freedom, to realize that democracy. How are we going to use institutions, et cetera? How are these things going to balance out? And Congregationalists are right in the thick of this discussion during this time. Okay, let me stop there. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And we'll see what kinds of comments or questions that folks have.
Okay.
Jane, do you have a comment?
No, not at the
Christian?
moment. But not right now.
Christian,
Yeah.
you just made a statement about next week. What we'd hear next week. Did you not say this was our last class for the
No, we
year?
have one more class.
Oh,
Next
okay.
week we'll
Thank
have
you.
one more episode of this particular class. So I'll talk a little bit about Theodore Weld. I'll talk about Oberlin College. We'll talk about the Unitarian schism, which also rocks the congregational churches. And I'll talk about probably the proliferation of voluntary societies like the American Missionary Society, the American Bible Society. A lot of the most significant these early Protestant societies some of them are being founded by Congregationalists. So we have quite a lineage. We have quite a history and lineage in our history.
Mm-hmm.
I think one of the things that is, just blows my mind is the level of courage that particularly the slave population has had to, they've had to endure, but oh my gosh, have they certainly fought. And it is very sad to me to realize how shall I say, how things moved into the background that allowed the level of ignorance I myself have experienced and been awoken to in recent days.
I appreciate those comments. And if we were just following that narrative too, I think you would see these moves forward and then moves back and moves forward and moves back. And I think one of the things too is that there was just not a realization of the nature of racism. There was sort of for a lot of people, there was an assumption of we're going to eradicate the sin of slavery. We're going to get rid of that. But what does that mean about what sometimes we term as prejudice? But all that stuff also winds up getting recodified, particularly in the South, but also in the North, as we've seen in some of the readings that we've done in our faith and justice commentaries or conversation. So thank you for those comments.
Interesting.
Heat the mushroom soup for you too?
Somebody's heating up some mushroom soup.
I'm sorry, I forgot to put my mute back on, Christian.
That's okay. No, that's all right. Any concluding comments or questions? Okay, so next week, join us. We'll pretty much bring ourselves up to the eve of the Civil War, and I'll try to provide maybe some additional dynamics that we have noted. If you remember a few weeks back, I noted there were some dynamics that we could see if we look back on the history of our tradition. And then I think now we can update or include some additional elements that we see that have evolved after the time period where we stopped there, which was pretty much not long after the first generation or so of the Puritans who had come over. So, and it looks like Deb Crocker was just mentioning her dad got his divinity degree at Oberlin, so she's looking forward to hearing about the founding of Oberlin. And it's a fascinating place, really, and plays a huge role actually in this period, particularly around abolition issues. Well, God bless you all. Yes, and I think I had also received an email, and I don't know that if the folks who are on, if you want to know, you can always see these on YouTube. And so if you need to go back, if there's something that I said and I went through it too quickly, or you want to have some time to take a look at that, feel free to do so. I'm always happy to be able to provide that for you. This is one of the benefits of technology right now. Yeah, did you have a comment?
Yeah, is there going to be a final?
Yes, there'll be a final. That's right, absolutely. It'll be an oral final.
Okay.
So I got to schedule all of our appointments. So send me an email. So let me say a quick word, and then and then we'll check out together. Lord, we thank you for this day. We thank you for the opportunity we have to look back and to try to assess in as generous a terms as we can, and to try to understand and put ourselves in other people's shoes. Specifically, not just to understand, but also maybe to find clues and hints for how we might move forward and what you're calling us to do in our time, which is going to be different, and yet also the same. Give us ears to hear and the courage and faith to follow you. We ask and pray all these things in your name. Amen. Blessings to everybody. Great to see you all.